If associationism is the oldest theory of learning and memory, certainly the most venerable mechanistic theory to account for associational learning and memory is the theory of the reflex. And as we shall see in today's lecture, this is a theory that will be developed ably by Pavlov and will become one of the stock notions in the experimental and theoretical psychology of the 20th century. Perhaps the first developed theory of the reflex was that served up by René Descartes, whose dates are 1596 to 1650. Descartes was a famous figure in his own day. He's often credited with being one of the founders of the modern philosophical movement because of his insistence on a skeptical approach to our own knowledge claims, adopting a position of doubt until the clearest ideas tell in favor of one view over another view. Descartes was also instrumental in developing analytical geometry. He was a figure of great expertise in the field of optics. And he was also very much concerned with developing a psychological theory that would account for the behavior of human and non-human animals. One of the things that encouraged Descartes in the direction of what I've referred to as the reflex theory or the reflex model were certain features in the gardens, the royal gardens in France. These were developed in such a way that you could go to a certain place in the garden and stand in front of a statue, very often involving a pair of figures, and you'd be standing on a platform that was covered over with grass or otherwise camouflaged. But once you stood on it, you would release a hydraulic system that actually would move through these objects and cause them to move, give them little pirouette movements and the like. Descartes, looking at this, and being expert, for the time anyway, in human physiology and animal physiology as well, reasoned that if you can have an inanimate object made to move this way, why not the same principles responsible for movement in animate objects, including the entire animal economy, human beings included as well? So Descartes put together a theory according to which nervous tubules, no one knew about neurons at the time, enough anatomy had been done throughout the Renaissance for Descartes to have a fairly good knowledge of general gross anatomy. He took the nervous tubules to be tube-like or hose-like processes filled with a very vaporous kind of fluid, which he referred to as animal spirits. Those fluids would infiltrate muscles, and when the muscle filled up, if, for example, the biceps muscle were to fill up with these fluids, the effect would be to pull the arm in this direction. If these muscles were filled with fluid, the arm would be moved in this direction. And by the proper application, the proper movement of these fluids throughout the body, you could get any degree of fine coordinated movement that you wished. As far as Descartes was concerned, the movement taking place, the sensations and movements taking place in the entire animal kingdom, except for human beings, were of this hydraulic, mechanical nature. In fact, I think much of what we've been doing to animals in laboratory settings for centuries probably is grounded in Descartes' notion that that animals really are a kind of mechanical device, not to be viewed as having the conscious, deliberative, rational processes of human beings, and therefore not really triggering in us any moral or ethical regard. There's a controversy about, there's a wonderful paper by a philosopher titled Was Descartes a Brute to the Beasts? And it has been argued on two sides whether Descartes really thought that animals were so lacking in psychological attributes as to deserve or warrant or be allowed to be treated in this way. Subject for another time, of course. But what Descartes did put in place was an essentially hydraulic mechanical model of movement in which human movements too were to be understood in such terms. Now, the question that naturally arises is how these movements are, of fluids, of the animal spirits, are regulated. And Descartes, again, recognizes that the brain is of central importance here, and so he's going to try to find somewhere within the complexities of the brain the place that will serve as the traffic manager for the movement of the animal spirits, which in turn move the body. Well, ever the geometer, Descartes locates a place that you'd reach if you went in through the ears and went down through the middle of the cranium. That point of intersection, which is very close to the center of the cranium itself, actually has a gland there, which, unlike much of the brain that would be available to Descartes' inspection, is not duplicated. There's only one of these, as opposed to there being two cerebral hemispheres and two thalamuses and the like. There's only one of these, and it turns out to be very, very close to the center, which is where a geometer would want this to be. And what gland is it but the pineal gland? So Descartes identifies the pineal gland as some sort of valvular mechanism that will regulate the flow of the animal spirits. As that gland allows certain animal spirits to move in one direction, you get movements of a certain kind and a paralysis or limitation of movements elsewhere in the body. So that's the general framework for what might be called Cartesian reflexology. More speculative than scientific, more suggestive than substantive, but authoritative, if only because served up by Descartes himself. Now, we get to the what might be called the science of reflex physiology, chiefly in the 18th century. Pioneering research done by the Scottish physician Robert Witt, or White, W-H-Y-T-T, who among other things was physician to the King of Scotland. And with Witt we actually find stimulation of the spinal cord in living animals, and the demonstration that you can get quite coordinated reflex movements by stimulating specific regions of the spinal cord. In fact, you can get reflex movements that would overcome what are otherwise the voluntary movements of the animal. So in the 18th century there is already a recognition. And by the way, certain reflex movements had been demonstrated even by Robert Boyle in the 17th century at the Royal Society. But with Witt, you start to get systematic studies of the organization of the spinal cord, the segmental organization of the spinal cord, the recognition that at various levels different regions of the body are being served, and movements in the extremities can be initiated by stimulating the right spinal cord segment. By the 19th century, work has proceeded to the point where Marshall Hall in Britain can put together a quite developed theory of reflex physiology, and a theory according to which even the complex behavior of complex organisms, ourselves included, can be accounted for in terms of the sensory motor connections mediated at the spinal level. Information, as Descartes saw it, coming into the organism through the sense organs, setting up patterns of activity within the medullary substances, these activities then being, get the word, reflected outward into the organs of movement. Reflex here referring to a kind of reflected activity, the input being reflected in the output, deflected to the output, and what we've got is now a machine capable of quite sophisticated movements. So that's background, and that gets us to the early 20th century and to the pioneering research and the great influence of Ivan Pavlov. Now, a few words about Pavlov. Pavlov, everybody knows about Pavlov and the conditioned reflex, conditioned salivation in dogs. Bell, food, bell, food, bell, food. You ring the bell and then the dog salivates. Well, let me provide the larger context within which this work was done. Pavlov was a physiologist. In fact, he was one of the leading physiologists of his day. He had studied at some of the major centers in Germany before returning to Russia and setting up his own laboratory. His particular interest was in digestive physiology. He wanted to know, he wanted to examine how the various places within the overall digestive or alimentary tract actually worked on ingested food. And to study this, he developed techniques. I don't think you would want to be an experimental subject in these studies, but he developed techniques that allowed him to put chemically known substances into the mouth of the experimental subject. In Pavlov's case, these were always dogs. Substances of known chemistry into the mouth, and then through cannulas inserted into the body of the animal, you would be able to extract these substances at specific places in the alimentary pathway, so that you could see how the known chemistry was changed by, for example, saliva, gastric juices produced in the intestines, in the stomach, the small intestine, large intestine, stomach, etc., etc., thereupon providing a fairly accurate statement of the chemical changes imposed by the digestive processes themselves. This work was so pioneering and exceptional as to earn Pavlov the Nobel Prize. He received the Nobel Prize for his pioneering studies of gastric physiology. Now, when people give Nobel Prize addresses in science, these addresses usually take one of several forms, sort of how I became great, or what we did that got us this prize in the first place, quite commonly what we're doing now. And Pavlov used the occasion of the Nobel Prize address to explain to a community of scientists and influential scientists what was going on in the laboratories in Russia at this time. Well, he begins the address by saying, this is the 1904 or 5 or 6, he begins the address by saying, surely everyone in this room has had the experience of coming home after a day's work on a cold day, entering one's residence, aromas wafting from the kitchen, and you find yourself salivating. So it comes as no surprise that a hungry person smelling food will salivate. Well, in our studies of gastric physiology in the dog, we soon discovered that when the assistants would wheel in the chemically precise powdered food that we were going to be putting in the dogs' mouths, before we ever brought this stuff over to the dogs would begin to salivate. Well, far from being surprised by this, we had every reason to believe that sort of thing would happen, and we wanted to determine quite precisely the conditions under which it would happen. Well, the rest, of course, is history. The way Pavlov proceeded then was that the dogs would be placed in a Pavlov frame, which essentially locked the forelimbs and hind limbs in place and kept the head stationary. You would then go over and put a quantity of powdered food in the dog's mouth after presenting some stimulus which would initially have absolutely no effect on salivation at all. What Pavlov chose were bell sounds, tone sounds, and the like. So there'd be boop, then powdered food in the mouth. A repetition of that tone, powdered food in the mouth. A repetition of that tone, powdered food in the mouth. And after a very few trials, if you presented the tone alone, the animal would salivate. Now, Pavlov recorded the quantity of saliva produced as a function of the number of pairings between the tone, a previously neutral stimulus, and the effective or adequate stimulus of powdered food. And of course, as associational theory would predict, the greater the number of pairings, the more reliably the previously neutral stimulus would be in eliciting this response. Pavlov began to develop a nomenclature or sets of terms to cover the major variables in these studies. He referred to the effect food has on salivation as an unconditional effect. That is, food in the mouth causes salivation first time out. It's a natural physiological response to salivate when food is put in the mouth. So food in this case, Pavlov referred to as an unconditional stimulus. That is, its efficacy is unconditional. In modern parlance, we've come to refer to such stimuli as, quote, unconditioned stimuli. Now, what about a tone? If you walk up to a dog and just go, boop, the dog doesn't start salivating all over the place. So the ability of a tone to elicit salivation is conditional on its being associated with what? With an unconditioned stimulus. So such stimuli, which originally have no efficacy at all, but come to be effective in virtue of being associated with an unconditioned stimulus, those stimuli are called conditioned stimuli. In Pavlov's idiom, initially these were called conditional. We call them conditioned stimuli. So the typical Pavlovian conditioning paradigm involves the presentation of a conditioned stimulus, followed by the presentation of an unconditioned stimulus, that pairing taking place often enough so that at a certain point, the conditioned stimulus alone will produce what is now properly called a conditioned response. Salivation to food is an unconditioned response. Salivation is unconditionally produced by food. Salivation to a tone is a conditioned response. It is salivation conditional upon a tone having been associated with an unconditioned stimulus. Well, here you have the basic setup for Pavlovian conditioning. Because it is the first form of conditioning reported in the literature, it's often referred to as classical conditioning. Classical conditioning, Pavlovian conditioning refer to the same thing. Now, Pavlov made a number of observations having established conditioned responses that would prove to be seminal in their influence on learning theory and behavioral psychology in general. Let's go back to the standard paradigm. A pure tone followed by food. A pure tone conditioned stimulus followed by food unconditioned stimulus. Let's say the pure tone we present is 500 cycles per second, something close to middle C on a keyboard, which is an octave above middle C on a keyboard, or an octave below middle C, or middle C, something like boop, 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 that sort of thing. And we're going to keep this the same tone trial by trial. Now we have tone, food, tone, food, tone, food. Let's say there's 100 pairings like this. And now we present the tone without any food, and we collect the saliva. So many milliliters of saliva. Let's say the tone we used was 500 cycles per second. Now we present a tone of 600 cycles per second, 400 cycles per second, 700 cycles per second, 250 cycles per second, 500 cycles per second. We present a range of tones, and what we're going to plot, what we're going to graph now is this. On the ordinate, the vertical line, we're going to plot the amount of saliva produced. On the horizontal line, or the abscissa, we're going to put the frequency of the tones we've used. The conditioned stimulus, let's say, is 500 cycles per second. What we discovered during these test trials is the greatest amount of salivation is to the conditioned stimulus. The greatest amount of salivation is to the tone of 500 cycles per second. And then there is a systematic reduction in salivation the further and further the test tones get from the conditioned stimulus. So if the conditioned stimulus is 500 cycles per second, you will get much more conditioned salivation to 400 than you will to 300, than you will to 200, than you will to 700, 800, and the like. The ability of a stimulus that is not the conditioned stimulus, but is physically similar to it, to elicit a conditioned response is what Pavlov referred to as stimulus generalization. That is, the conditioned response will generalize around a range of values. It will generalize to values of stimulation different from the conditioned stimulus, but lying on the same physical continuum with the conditioned stimulus. Now, suppose you do the experiment in a rather different way. You present a conditioned stimulus, 500 cycle tone, followed by food in the mouth. But during this very training procedure, you also present stimuli that are 400, 300, 600, 700. But when you present those, there is no unconditioned stimulus delivered. So on all the trials in which the conditioned stimulus is present, food follows. And on any trial where any tone other than the conditioned stimulus is presented, no food follows. Well, in this case, when you later test, you discover that there is much, much less salivation to those stimuli that are not the conditioned stimulus. Pavlov went even further. Suppose you mildly shock the animal. If there is any salivation to a stimulus other than the conditioned stimulus, well, you now can make this response even sharper, and sharper, and sharper. This tendency now for conditioned responses to be confined to the conditioned stimulus through training procedures is what Pavlov referred to as stimulus discrimination. Well, suppose you so tax the animal by punishing salivation to stimuli other than the conditioned stimulus by not presenting rewards whenever any stimulus other than the conditioned stimulus is presented. You keep this up to make the discrimination sharper and sharper and sharper. What Pavlov found is this: at a certain point, the animal psychologically breaks down. The animals will be found to quiver. They might urinate and defecate in place. Their eating habits become entirely different. They might become extremely passive or extremely irascible. Pavlov referred to this condition as experimental neurosis. And the model that he was advancing, if I can give a more modern terminology to it, but the model he was advancing was a model of psychological breakdown arising from an organism having to make discriminations that go beyond that organism's discriminative capacities. It's almost as if Pavlov is understanding early in the 20th century that a certain degree of information overload simply results in the failure of the system to preserve intact its resources and adaptive capacities. And this line of thinking in Pavlovian theory would come to influence clinical thinking as well, particularly in the 1930s and 40s. I don't know that too much of that kind of thinking survives now. Now, Pavlov was not simply a skillful investigator and a Nobel Prize-winning physiologist. He was also a man with a mission in life. A mission in life in what we might call philosophy of science and in what we might call theoretical psychology. Pavlov was relentless in insisting that the language of psychology, the theories of psychology, reference to mental life, reference to thought, that all this was a residual of superstitious ages of ignorance, that in fact when psychology finally was developed in a scientific way, it would just be physiology by another name, that the ultimate explanations for psychological processes are physiological explanations. He wrote essays to this effect. He wrote a very famous essay titled, which was published in the United States in the Psychological Review, titled "A Physiologist's Reply to Psychologists," in which he again insists that psychological talk about mental life and thoughts and cognition and consciousness and the like, it all made quite good sense, but it should be understood as a kind of folk understanding, and as scientific understanding replaces folk understanding, the language of psychology gets replaced by the language of physiology. Now, he put his theoretical money, I should say, where his philosophy of science mouth was, in attempting to explain the very effects that he found in his research, for example, stimulus generalization, stimulus discrimination. The theoretical account he puts forward is based on what he assumes to be processes in the animal's cerebral cortex. How do we account then for stimulus generalization? What's the basis upon which animals will salivate to stimuli different from, but lying along the same physical continuum with, the conditioned stimulus? If you present a sound to an animal, Pavlov says, you excite the nervous system. There are regions in the brain that respond selectively to sound. Now, Pavlov at that time did not know about primary and secondary auditory areas, but he reasoned quite correctly that sound is represented in the nervous system somewhere in the cerebral cortex of animals that have a cerebral cortex, you see. All right. Now, it doesn't take much imagination to suppose that a given frequency of sound will have a special locus of representation in the nervous system. That is, the place where a 500 cycle per second sound has its greatest effect will be an identifiable place, and trial to trial to trial, that will be the same place maximally activated by a 500 cycle per second tone. But surely the system is not so exquisitely tuned that only one tiny place responds. Rather, says Pavlov, find the place maximally excited by a 500 cycle tone, and regions just adjacent to it will also be excited by a 500 cycle tone, but not stimulated as much. Well, suppose the layout for the auditory system in the brain is such that, in fact, frequencies are adjacently represented. That is, the region of the brain maximally stimulated by a 500 cycle tone is next to the region of the brain maximally stimulated by a 490 cycle per second tone. 480, 460. Well, now look what happens. We present a 500 cycle tone, 500 cycle per second tone. Here's a region maximally excited, but the adjacent regions are also excited. From the point of view, if you could talk this way, from the point of view of the adjacent regions, it's as if a 490 cycle per second tone had been presented somewhat less intensely. And a 480, 450, 400, 300, 600, 650, 700. So what you are getting is a spread of excitation, the magnitude of which diminishes the further away you get from 500 cycles per second. So Pavlov says the best explanation of stimulus generalization at the level of behavior is in terms of the spread of cortical excitation at the level of brain physiology. So that the behavior, stimulus generalization behavior observable in the animal now reveals underlying cortical processes just as systematic, just as tuned, just as mapped, do you see, as what the behavior itself is reporting. What do we want to say about this theory? Well, we want to say this. If the entire nervous system were arranged the way the auditory part of the nervous system is arranged, Pavlov really would have been onto something, because, in fact, auditory cortex does display what is called, quote, tonotopic organization, T-O-N-O-T-O-P-I-C. That is to say, adjacent frequencies are adjacently represented in the auditory cortex. But this is unique to auditory frequencies. The loudness areas are not adjacent to each other, and color isn't adjacent, and shape and form. The whole domain in which we get reliable stimulus generalization effects includes cortical representations that are not at all so topographically organized. So the theory was a nice try and a failing try. Nonetheless, Pavlovian conditioning was powerfully influential in psychology, and this for the following reasons. First, it provided the means by which behavior could be scientifically studied, the complexities of behavior scientifically studied. Secondly, as a result of Pavlovian theory, the behavior was very closely tied to the discipline, the science of physiology. Psychology, from the outset, has labored valiantly to earn and enjoy scientific status, and there is always an attempt by psychologists to render the discipline ever more scientific. Historically, this has been really an attempt to render it ever more physiological. That would clearly be the absorbing science or the covering science. Thirdly, Pavlov provided a model that would allow one to understand the breakdown of psychological processes. The effect of experimental neurosis is quite a dramatic effect. And so, long after Pavlovian conditioning ceased to be dominant in behavioristic American psychology, there were still clinical applications of the model in which, for example, phobias would be treated by a kind of counter-conditioning. The young school phobic, the child who won't go near the school building. Well, you provide a little furry animal that the child likes, and in order to get the furry animal, he's got to walk halfway down the street, then 2/3 of the way down the street. Then the animal is left at the school door. And this is a very, very Pavlovian kind of operation in which you are pairing off aversive tendencies with quite positive tendencies and extinguishing the former. There still to this day are behaviorists that use Pavlovian forms of counter-conditioning for such things as the treatment of phobias. Now, I can't say that contemporary behavioristic psychology continues to be indebted to the Pavlovian model, and that departure from Pavlov will be the subject of subsequent lectures. But the background influence of Pavlov is still there. The physiologized psychology that he so vigorously defended is still very much with us, and he is certainly the opening chapter of a 20th century behavioral science.